So it's a great pleasure to have Nicole Seymour in the reading group this week. Nicole has written an iconic new book on bad environmentalism, and you've also shared with us a new essay that's kind of getting inside of the eco-sexual community and doing some critical work there. And I think, you know, you asked us to read one chapter of the book, Climate Change is Drag and Camping Can Be Campy, alongside this new essay. And, you know, I think, you know, one of the questions that you start this chapter with, I think, is kind of continued into this new essay, looking at ways that a queer positionality might move from being an anti-environmental position to sort of more playful engagements with environmental themes. And I just love the way that your work is, you know, so we're taught to have these affects, you know, doom and gloom and, you know, cynicism and all kinds of things that just make living in this world a lot heavier. And yeah, I think what I really love about your work is that you're not only engaging with these playful generative approaches, but also doing it with a really interesting critical lens. So maybe I'll just ask one really specific question to kick us off. I thought the issue of consent was really interesting as you were both talking about eating a raspberry and also sniffing a flower. You know, you sniff a flower and I think it was Annie Sprinkle said, like, you just had sex with that flower. And, you know, you do some deep reading of like the suggestion that eating a raspberry might be like performing oral sex. And to me, it's interesting, you know, thinking even with, you know, kind of a pop theorist of plant agency like Michael Pollan, who's inviting us to think about plant desires and how plant desires can sort of co-opt humans as agents. And I was thinking of, you know, flowers and fruits as these sort of quintessential objects of co-optation, you know, animals being co-opted by these other vegetal beings. Mm-hmm. And yeah, maybe it's like tricking us into non-consensual relations. So I just invite you to sort of play with that idea of consent a little bit and unravel it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was at the ASLE conference last summer that someone gave a talk, if anyone was there, remind me, someone gave a talk about having a tree write poetry by, like, I don't remember the details, but sort of like hooking up some, you know, there was some computer involved in the tree, you know, based on the way that the branches were moving, was sort of producing this text or whatever. My friend was very upset about this presentation. It was like, has the tree consented to be a poet? That's a big, you know, move. But I think in the example of the smelling the flower thing, I think like the reason that I sort of have this weird reaction to that is it's more about like my consent, where this reframing of you just had sex with the flower, like I didn't consent to that either, right? And so I don't know. I think that this question, I don't really know that I have anything brilliant to say about that, but I think that the question is just not coming up around plants the same way it is about animals. And I think I'm just still trying to think through that. And then this desire, like this term, there's so much slippage between all these terms that I think that also sort of bothers me, where it's like desire, like desire isn't always sexual, right? It's not even like, I don't even know if desire is the right word to use for this idea that like plants want to reproduce or things want to live. I don't know that desire is the right word for it, because then it so easily gets folded into sexuality. And I think I mentioned in the chapter that yeah, all these terms like sensuality and sexuality and love and sex and desire and want are all being kind of like collapsed. And I think I'm just nervous about that. And maybe I shouldn't be nervous. That's really not like me to worry about such things. But for some reason, I'm having this strange reaction. So yeah, still thinking through that. Yeah.
And for those who are joining for the first time, you know, feel free to just unmute yourself or type a question in the chat if you want to ask Nicole a question. But I'll keep peppering you with questions until someone else jumps in. At a part in this essay, you're saying, you know, sort of more to come on the erotic, and you mentioned that Audrey Lorde has a feminist definition of the uses of the erotic, and I don't know that literature and would love to just hear you riff more on the multiple valences of that term. And I also found it really interesting that you were presenting this at an asexual conference, which is also like offering us some critical distance from some of the eco-sexual discourse.
Yeah, so there's a book, I do not know how to pronounce her last name, so let me, I'll drop it in the chat in just a second, but there's a new book out called Asexual Erotics, Intimate Readings of Compulsory Sexuality, and I'll just drop it right here. So that this person, Ella, is the person that organized the conference that I went to. And so I've been really influenced by her work. And that was like actually a question that I had, which is that I think in dominant culture, when people say erotic, again, it's one of those slippages, right? Like you don't go to a store that has like erotic videos and like expect to just see like, you know, like videos of like trees blowing in the wind or something, right? You think you know what you're getting. So I think in like dominant culture, erotic has that slippage into sexuality. And so I remember asking her at this conference, like, I'm confused by this phrase, asexual erotics. And then she explained this sort of specifically feminist and Black feminist lineage of the erotic as pleasure and sustaining, and like Audrey Lorde talks about, it's been a while since I read it, but talks about like building a bookcase as like erotic, right? And so these are just such competing definitions where like I just don't think of building, I think of building a bookshelf is very annoying. But so yeah, but I think she's coming more from this like, I guess, pleasure activism that is Audrey Lorde, but also the author of this book, coming from this sort of pleasure activism realm, and I'm drawing that term from Adrienne Marie Brown, that this idea that that there has to be pleasure to sustain us in activism, right? That we can't, again, not just that we can't deal with the gloom and doom, but the activism itself must be pleasure. We must be making connections. And so for Audrey Lorde, I would say the erotic is another way of saying pleasure, but again, in the dominant culture, erotic means sexual. And so that's where I get this kind of, and then, you know, this is my whole affect, it's like my personality as well as like my scholarship, that I like ironic distance. And I think ironic distance can do a lot of work. And that's what I'm writing about in that chapter. And so words like, you know, the erotic or the sensual or the spiritual, they do this sort of self-seriousness that I personally don't like, and in my scholarship I'm sort of arguing against. So yeah, the erotic is one of those words that gives me like the heebie-jeebies, but I've said too much about myself already, I think. So yeah.
Towards the end here, you're kind of you're exploring these youngsters who are really into houseplants, like the indoor generation, and then kind of, you know, it seems like it's initially kind of this crafty aesthetic, but then it kind of turns into the Instagram influencer economy. And yeah, maybe talk about the tensions surrounding capital in this piece. I think there's a lot of capital pushing and pulling both ways, and you know, maybe goes back to a longer conversation that Haraway and others have been involved with. You know, she's got this idea of lively capital where commerce and conscience, and this is maybe like serious, like, you know, I don't want to be too serious here, but you know, she talks about commerce and consciousness, ethics and utility, bioengineering, kind of all in play, and lively capital. And, you know, talking to Donna recently about that, I'd always taken it as kind of an affirmative biopolitics of a sort, like a lively engagement with the possibilities of capital for multi-species futures. But I think she's trying to render it as a more ambivalent formulation. So, you know, do we need these Instagram, like, are these Instagram influencers, like where do you cast your lot? Like, do we need to destroy capital? Do we need to make capital more fun and erotic and playful? And maybe I'm asking this with a little bit of Beatrice Precadio in the mix too, you know, the Testo Junkie treatise that is celebrating these libidinal economies that are, you know, very pornographic and in their articulation. So yeah, just wondering where you are situating this with respect to those articulations with capital.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think about that more, but I mean, there's been plenty of critiques, like, I mean, I'm trying to think of how long it's been since we've been talking about self-care, right? Like maybe 5 years or something. But of course, there's this long feminist lineage of maybe not using those terms, but yeah, just thinking back to Audrey Lorde, right? This idea of how do we sustain ourselves like in a system that's constantly grinding us down, and it's it wasn't but 30 seconds until people started talking about self-care, then that became like commodified, right? Like so now you pay people to tell you how to do self-care. And yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know, I'd have to think about, and I'm thinking about Kate Sandilands' work here a lot, because she's, and I should say critical plant studies is actually very, very new to me, as you can probably tell here, but she's talking about how plant genes are manipulated, and the vegetal is being penetrated like ever more deep in order to be like more productive, right? So it's not just that we're expected to be more productive like in our daily lives, but plants are expected to be more productive, and surely animals as well. And so I am sort of interested in this idea that we're all suffering, right? The plants are suffering and we're suffering, and we're being more and more is being extracted from us. And yeah, and then the influencers, I mean, like, can you blame them, right? Like, what's the future for someone who's like 22 and just graduated, right? Like, this is a great way to make money. I don't know. So I don't want to be too like too down on that culture, but yeah. But yeah, and then it comes back to this question again of the asexuality, right? Where it's like, oh, suddenly asexuality is a place to make money, right? It used to be like the family was the place, to reproduce capital. And now it's like, oh, not getting married, no problem, just like, just buy more plants or buy more stuff for your apartment. Like, so yeah, but I'd have to think, I haven't thought about connecting that to Preciado or even Haraway. I mean, I mentioned Haraway briefly, but yeah.
I was also, I want to bring Adriana in here in a minute, but she's going back to Audrey Lorde and the erotic, but also just this idea of futurity, which you take up in kind of counterpoint to Lee Edelman.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to hear, so I mean, your work charts this interesting path between, yeah, you're like kind of unmasking some of the problematic dimensions of this play, and the ways that white cisgendered able-bodied people are taking up these spaces, and but at the same time you are reclaiming a certain sort of futurity. So I would just love to hear just unravel that a little bit more, like how you see this doing different kinds of work than Edelman's No Future.
Yeah, so I don't know if people were able to read the first chapter, but there was, I guess I'd say like 10 years ago, there was sort of this big, like, it was referred to as the negative turn or the antisocial turn in queer theory, where it was, just this sort of, nihilist, like, I mean, literally the book is No Future, right? But, Halberstam and, I mean, Tim Dean was a little critical of that, but was sort of participating. So this sort of like, fuck your future, fuck, and there's a lot of, fuck reproductive futurity in particular. And there was some good pushback. I think a lot of like indigenous scholars were sort of thinking, who has the privilege to say like, I don't care about the future, and, whose future has been foreclosed. And when I was working on my first book, I sort of came out of like seeing these intersecting discourses, and then also starting to recognize like a nascent kind of queer ecology. So Kate Sandilands' work was coming out at that time, and just sort of, yeah, just thinking of like, isn't there a way to care about the future that's not heteronormative, that's not replicating these same structures, right? Caring about non-human kin, caring about a future that maybe you'll never see and no one related to you will ever see. And then so in this chapter, I'm sorry, the chapter 3, not the plant thing, but I was sort of taking that into this possible new direction, which is to think about the palliative, and that comes from Sarah Ensor. So palliative meaning sort of like end of life care, or caring for things that might not make it, might not live, or might not live for very long. And that's another way that for me, queer studies and environmental studies intersects, because there's this long history of theorizing palliative care through AIDS communities, right, and AIDS care communities, and sort of thinking of, so what Ensor is doing with that is sort of, and I think Neil Ahuja is someone that's kind of drawn on the history of AIDS activism intersecting with environmental activism. I'm not sure if I just pronounced his last name correctly, but anyway, so I'm thinking with Sarah Ensor's idea of, you know, the palliative might be the strategy that we need right now, because things are dying, right? We could try to save the world, and I can talk about the problem with that, those sorts of phrasings, but the world is still is currently dying, right? So maybe we need to have a different sort of attention, and we might draw inspiration and also models from AIDS activism, you know, lesbian women that were caring for AIDS patients in the 80s and 90s and so forth. So yeah, so now I'm thinking of futurity in this, I guess, like patchy way, to quote Hannah Singh, that it's neither this guaranteed thing, it's not something you can control, but it also doesn't make sense to say the future is foreclosed. So it's a tenuous kind of future. So yeah,
I love it. It's super important. Melanie or Adriana, do you want to jump in, either talking about the plant lovers of Mozambique or the erotic in Audrey Lorde?
Sure. Thank you for these super interesting readings. I just wanted to say that I think the treatment of Audrey Lorde is maybe not, I don't quite agree with it. I think, you know, there's a difference between this kind of, what's her name? The performance artist that you were just talking about, Sprinkle and kind of ecofeminism's eroticization of everything, and the way that Lorde was kind of talking about the erotic as a kind of a pulse of life in a kind of in a mode of survival for Black lesbians that I think is different, and it matters. The specificity of that matters. So I know that you're working with a queer lineage and everything, but I think that it doesn't quite do justice to the way that Lorde was really thinking about the erotic, even though you might have, you know, objections to that as well. It's kind of collapsed a little bit, and I don't think they're the same thing. So that's all. That's why I was kind of pointing back to the Lorde. But thank you. I've really enjoyed reading these.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think I do want to separate them, just to be clear. I think that, yeah, I mean, this is just a problem of terminology, right? That we don't all think the same thing when we hear different words. But yeah, I agree that I think they should be separated. Yeah.
Melanie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I also enjoyed both papers a lot. The plant that is reminding me a lot of an article by Julie Archambault about plant lovers in Mozambique, and she studies young men who garden and describe, I mean, some of whom describe their plants as their lovers, and she explains it in a context of this love being real, being a real ontological relationship, but also contextualizes it in a kind of post-war, post-socialist context and history in which a lot of young men are excluded from intimate relationships that are highly commodified. So I think I would be interested in more context of the plant that is, because I think that kind of like New York Times stories were highly like America focused, and I just think it would be interesting there to go a bit deeper and look into, you know, kind of the context and the histories of that. And then a second question is around, I think, I mean, it was mentioned before, the whole like control of plant sexuality that is, I mean, very hectic in the context of house plants, but of course also just connects to longer histories of capitalist and colonial exploitation of plants. But also, I mean, to current conservation projects, restoration projects, where, I mean, on the one hand, plants are highly controlled, but then also like there are these like pockets of autonomy where plants just do their own thing and hybridize in spaces where they are meant to be controlled. And the greenhouse and the botanical garden being among these spaces. So I wonder if there are, like kind of like under the radar things happening in the greenhouse. I don't know how big that greenhouse is. I didn't look at that picture, but as soon as you have a lot of plants in one space that wouldn't be in the same place in their natural habitats, and there are pollinators. And I mean, there actually people are invited to be pollinators. So all kinds of interesting things might be happening.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot to think about. Just going in order, the context is very North American, and I need to clarify that. And I think I mean, maybe it was implied, but I think I need to talk more about things like the Great Recession and just like how, I mean, I think I said this, but I didn't go into it, that how economics are shaping these relations, right? They're not, I mean, economics are shaping all erotic relations, but how it's not just a trend. Like, it is a trend on Instagram, but it is related to, again, like, rent being out of control in metropolitan coastal cities and things like that. But yeah, definitely need to think more about context. And thank you for that reference. I had not, I think I mentioned the herbivore men of Japan, and I'm trying to think about how to connect that, or maybe not connect it, but yeah, I think it'd be interesting to compare different contexts in which similar kinds of things are happening. And then as for the greenhouse, I've been interviewing the Pony Express people, just kind of off and on through email, and that would be a really good question to ask, is like, what are these species, and how are they interacting with each other? And just something sort of related to that, when I was talking about this project to people at Berkeley, they were sort of saying, like, well, it's these exotic plants that are like most popular, right? The monstera. And some of them are being smuggled, right? They're being obtained illegally. They're being obtained against the wishes of indigenous peoples. They're being co-opted in these various ways. But the thing I'm sort of thinking about is that I don't think people know where their plants are coming from, and I don't know if they care. And I don't think that makes it okay, but I think what you see in a lot of these accounts is, people aren't researching the background. They don't know, is this an American plant? Is this a exotic species or not? And I don't even know where the origin of some of my plants are coming from. And someone was trying to ask me a question about like the exoticization of plants and the exoticization of like the exotic as like a sexual category and also as a plant category. And I'm just not sure. I mean, I'm interested in this idea, but I'm just not sure, because I don't know that people pick plants because they think they're exotic, as in like coming from another place, or if they pick them for aesthetic reasons. And that, I mean, I don't even know how to how to research that. Like, I don't know if I need to be like interviewing more millennials about their plants or something, but yeah, it's something to think about, right? Where are these plants coming from, and what are the ethics of that, and then how are they actually perceived, right? So, and the pockets of autonomy, I mean, also just the fact that a lot of these like Instagram accounts, a lot of these like YouTube channels, they're dedicated to teaching people how to take care of plants, because people don't know, right? They don't know how plants work. They kill them constantly. I do this as well. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about, I mean, I think that the idea of the sort of moments when plants are getting out of control would be a nice counterpoint to this question of consent, right? So when plants are sort of doing their own thing outside of human attempts at control would be interesting to think about. So yeah, thank you.
So circling back to issues of consent, we've got Sevgi.
I don't know, Sevgi, you might have to, so selective breeding of plants, meaning, can you say more about that? Is Sevgi still there?
Hello. I just wanted to hear more reflections about the monocultural, agricultural, industrial applications of this kind of selective breeding and the other applications. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not really thinking in that direction so far. I mean, I think I have to at some point. Mostly I've been interested in just sort of like domestic, like individual care plants, which obviously relates to these larger structures. Although again, I don't think people are aware of those structures, which doesn't mean that they don't matter, but I'm just trying to think of like, what are the relations people think they're engaging with when they get a houseplant, for example. So would I think of that as for sex? I don't know. I don't know. And if we did think of it as for sex, what would be the upshot of that? I don't know. Sprinkle, and so this mini film festival that I mentioned in the plant piece, it was just last week, called, I think it's called Earth is Your Lover, and I think you can still watch the films online. That was one of the Q&A questions, and they said that they get this question all the time, right? And on the one hand, I feel like annoying asking it because it's such an obvious question, but I'm not coming from a place of like, I think this isn't consent. I just don't know like what people are thinking, right? And they said something, I think their answer was something super vague, like, oh, we have ways of sensing whether plants want to touch us or be touched, but they didn't really expound on how that works. So, but they had this sense of like, yeah, just you need to be attuned, you need to be open, and you need to be thoughtful. And so obviously they're coming at this from a very different direction than like some massive agricultural operation. So I don't know. I mean, this is my huge question. I don't know. Yeah.
So there's been, I wouldn't say rich, but there's a couple of key things that have been published about animals, and I put two of them in the chat there. One from Vincent Dupre about horses, and it's really graphic. I'm warning you ahead of time. It's about guys who like to bottom for horses, and some don't. Some of the people don't make it. But Peter Singer also has weighed in. This very, if you know Singer's work, he's like, Mr. Serious animal rights philosopher. And this piece kind of starts out by, saying it's not polite dinner party conversation, but like, who hasn't been humped by a dog? And just, inviting us to think about animals as desiring subjects too. But then also like, chickens, probably there are people who do that, and, it's not a pretty sight. And I'm imagining, at least some of these moments that you described in the piece where people are getting it on with grass or whatever, probably not such a, like grass. I don't know. Can you maybe just say more about what you think the plant's experience of some of these, being treated as an object of desire by a human might be like?
I don't know. This is the whole question. I have no idea. I don't even know what it's like to want to have sex with a plant, so I can't begin to imagine what it would be like for a plant to have sex with a human. So I'm just thinking about the this mini film festival where, so there's different. If we're getting graphic, I'll describe some of the films. But and I should say, if I didn't fully explain it in the piece, Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens put out a call for short films, and there's specifically 1-minute films, and I forget what the whole project is. It's called the 1-minute film festival or something. Anyway, and so they curated this film festival specifically related to eco-sexuality, quote unquote. And a lot of it was, I don't know, people doing things like putting their vaginas on top of water, right? Which seems like, I mean, that's a whole other question, right? Like the water versus like a plant. But there's definitely someone putting her vagina on a cactus, which just really seems unpleasant. But again, I don't know, these are not my things. And in this Q&A, again, Annie and Beth said something, I think it is in the paper, about people think it's oral and vaginal what we're talking about, but a lot of it is conceptual, which again is one of those interesting moments where they sort of want to disavow things a little bit and say, oh, it's just it's in your mind, which isn't most sex in your mind, right? And so, yeah, so at times they kind of want to get away from this sort of lurid imagery of like, oh, this is people, you know, actually having sex with plants, and say that it's a little more figurative than that. But yeah, I don't know what it's like to be a plant and someone has sex with you. I really, really don't. So I'm doing the disavowing too, so clearly.
Or even in that earlier question, you know, what it's like to be a raspberry and be eaten, right? You know, presume like it's consent, like the plant makes this thing to be eaten by, you know, but it's still living cells. So it's
Yeah.
I don't know,
Well,
all kinds of alien ontologies to think about.
yeah, I mean, Jeffrey Nealon talks about, is it Jeffrey Nealon? Yeah, Jeffrey Nealon sort of talks about this question of, I'm sure a lot of people have read this, but the, how was it called? Just plant theory? I think it's called plant theory. Where, you know, he talks about like Carrie Wolf having this real aversion to, and a lot of animal studies people saying like, oh, well, we can't possibly take any of these questions into the realm of the vegetal, right? Because then like you'd starve to death, right? Like, so if you say like, oh, you know, animals should not be eaten, and then suddenly say plants cannot be eaten, there's nothing left, right? And so, and Nealon says, I mean, he has this really interesting take on it where he says, first of all, there's a little bit of like closing the barn door after your favorite species has gotten in, right? So it's like, you know, so it's like animal studies people are like, no, clear, there's a clear stoppage there. But he also says that that doesn't mean that that's the direction it has to go, right? So if we recognize that plants have feelings, that doesn't mean let's not eat them, right? It might mean something else. We don't know what that next step is. And so I guess that's sort of where I'm having this problem with this piece is like, I don't know where the next step is either, but I do think that there's, yeah, if we must use this term erotic, like that there is something about, you know, there's a reason that people are eroticizing plants, right? Because they are responsive, because they are sensitive, because they move, right? But what does that mean to recognize that? That's a huge question. So.
Hannah, did you want to, I was glad to see Sophie Chow's work in there. She's a former PhD student and now collaborator on a project on multi-species justice. Do you want to talk about that piece in particular and how it might decenter and recenter questions about plant daddies?
Well, it's a really great. Nicole, I really loved your both your chapters. I found them really interesting. The kind of critique of eco-sexuality was like that I had like been thinking about for a while, but not really got to grips with. And you made that really clear, and I really enjoyed that. The Sophie Chow's work, I think it's a really great piece, and she talks about I guess similar themes to the idea of plants as familial substitutes, because she talks about workers in Sumatra who are internal migrants from other parts of Indonesia who are working in palm oil plantations, and there's a tension between how the scientists perceive the plants and how the everyday nursery workers do, and almost everyone in context is male. And she talks about how the nursery workers take on their vision themselves as like mothers to the plants, and how they use a lot of like familial terms and affection towards their babies, and that this, and she talks about how this is partly because as internal migrants, they are often really like displaced from their actual kin relations, and so these plants are filling this gap akin to, though different to, the millennial plant gap. And I think what's also really interesting, because she also stuff around plant agency, because these plants are not cute house plants. They're old palm plantations, and they are these destructive plants. They are these like unloving others that she kind of also kept over her other work. And so I think it does really interesting things about the idea of like giving care and love to a plant that is harmful on some ecological level. So yeah, I thought like it kind of spoke to this in different ways.
Thank you. You're reminding me of sort of another maybe avenue to go down. Maybe this is too crazy. Use the phrase cute, you know, they're not cute houseplants, and just thinking about, oh God, what's that book? I'm going to completely blank out on the author's last name. Our aesthetic categories, zany, cute, something else. Sion, Sienna, essay, and
Aye.
thank you. Okay. Yeah, thinking about, I actually had not even gone in that direction of thinking of, people talk about like charismatic megafauna and, cuteness in animals. Why do we find animals cute? And, there's that theory about like the eyes are like, bigger than, or when animals are babies and also when humans are babies, that their eyes are abnormally big for, for their bodies. But yeah, I actually had not thought of the category of cuteness. And now I'm really interested because personally, I guess I think of like certain cacti as cute for some reason. I would have to think more about that. But yeah, where would the cuteness come from if there's that quotation I think I have from Natanya Meeker and Antonia Sabari where they talk about like plant bodies and how they don't have the same pieces that we do, and just yeah, that's really interesting to think through. Where would cuteness be located in a plant body, and why? So wow, you blew my mind. Okay. Thank you.
I'm also wondering how, just coming back to coronavirus, we've kind of veered away in recent weeks in the reading group from coronavirus, but stay tuned. We are going to be actually going back deep into the realms of science and, coronavirus in coming weeks. But, in thinking about these eco-sexual relations with plants and these other sort of modes of camp and drag with respect to climate change, are you seeing any kind of allied modes of cultural production around the pandemic that you're finding interesting?
Oh yeah, digital drag. I became obsessed with it. So there's, I think there's more than one. So the first digital drag show was by Bitch Puddin, like BIQCTH. There's a Q in there somewhere. Yeah, I became obsessed. She's one of the, she's related to, oh gosh, I forget their name. The people that do Dragula. So it's like this very like goth drag. Like it's not, it's very like, like bloody and gory sort of drag. So I got really into that. I mean, this is like a huge conversation, right, about queer spaces. The bars have been allowed to stay open, or sorry, restaurants have been allowed to stay open, but bars haven't. And in Long Beach, where I'm from, there's been this sort of debate over, like the homophobia of those policies, right, where it's queer spaces can't stay open, but restaurants, because they serve food, can stay open, which actually doesn't make a lot of sense. But yeah, I've been working on something on Tiger King. I'm sure everyone watched Tiger King, and just sort of thinking of Joe Exotic as a bio drag king. Sort of, I'm working with Hannah Kate Boast. I don't know if people know her, who's an animal studies person, and yeah, just sort of thinking about connecting things like digital drag and Tiger King, like these sort of like simultaneous experiences, simultaneous but virtual experiences, and where was I going with that? I forgot. But yeah, and just sort of, there's been so much discussion of like what's happening to people in like heterosexual relationships during the pandemic. There's been all these pieces about coronavirus's like death for feminism, right? And all these, especially in academia, right? Women are doing the majority of the childcare and the home care, and domestic violence, and sort of we're kind of trying to think about things like digital drag and Tiger King as like not alternatives to that, but thinking about what it means that these queer forms are sort of proliferating at a time when coronavirus is sort of highlighting like the disaster of heterosexuality. So stay tuned for that essay. And then, like, of course, everyone was buying either buying houseplants or like roller skates or baking bread, so like plants have become particularly important during coronavirus. So yeah. But, yeah, I haven't quite made the like actually there is a drag queen who dresses as a plant named John Jarbo, but that's not a coronavirus related thing. That was a pre-corona thing, but I might have to bring him in here at some point. So yeah.
And maybe if you could talk, I don't see other questions. If anyone has one, jump in. But yeah, if you could just talk broadly about kind of what the next book project is, if you want to imagine it. There's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of sort of line questions that I've got back in the article, but I'd love to just hear about the future of your work and how this ties into bigger projects.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, if there's time later, I will ask you all questions, which is what to do with this piece, because it's not, for me, it's really not hanging together. And I don't know if it's because there's too many approaches or it's just underdeveloped. But yeah, this is sort of like a one-off thing where, I mean, obviously it's related to you know, again, my interest in queer ecologies, but yeah, this feels like sort of a weird side thing that I don't love. But yeah, I'm working on a book about glitter right now that's going to be for the Bloomsbury has a series called Object Lessons. So there's one on the hamburger that's really great, and one on the refrigerator, and lots that sort of have environmental humanities relations. But yeah, so it's kind of, I guess I'm explaining it as a cultural history of glitter. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it, but it sort of grew out of the great glitter backlash of 2017, where a scientist in New Zealand made some statement to a newspaper that got taken up by every newspaper in the UK and the US about, you know, all glitter is microplastic, quote unquote, and should be banned, which is not true because it's not all microplastic. But there was this whole, basically every November, this story gets recycled that glitter is terrible for the environment. And, you know, as someone who writes against like doom and gloom, I felt uncomfortable with that, even if it were true. And it turns out, you know, it's not true that all glitter is microplastic, and it's also not true that glitter is a major source of microplastics, but something felt a little like homophobic about it to me, right? And a little joy killing. So I'm interested in sort of exploring like where that backlash comes from and why people have such strong feelings for or against glitter. And also sort of taking glitter as an example of how objects are being sort of remade and rethought in sustainable ways, and sort of thinking about, you know, does glitter even have to be an object, right? Could it be an effect? Could it be created through other means? And I get to do fun stuff in the book. Like I'm doing like a mini chapter on like taste tests of glitter beers, because there's all these glitter beers that mysteriously get marketed around June for Pride, mostly in the US. But and with those, the quote unquote glitter is actually like dextrose, right? So it's not even little fragments. It's like sort of a more pearlescent, I don't know, effect. And so just, yeah, sort of thinking about making and remaking objects and how their constitution can change over time, and how we can expand what glitter means, just like we can expand what other things mean. So yeah, so that's my fun project right now, and it's obviously more public facing, so that's been nice too, to not have to read everything and not cite everything. That feels very freeing to just sort of like, I'm gonna write this paragraph and not sort of, you know, give 1,000 footnotes or whatever. But yeah, so that's a new project.
Cesar, do you want to jump in with plants and parasites?
Okay, just kind of a small, so not many plants, but a couple, and then suddenly we start having some flies, and we start having some issues, and one gets into the other, and what basically got me wondering on the reactions towards plants. So if you can have an effective relation to a plant versus the relation to the mosquito or to the parasite, and how those kind of emotional ecologies play out in.
Yeah, I don't know. Is there something you have in mind in terms of like, I don't know, clearly I don't know anything. Are there people that are like in love with mosquitoes? Is this like a thing? I'm curious, is this a thing I should know about, or do you just mean in general, like what do you mean to?
No, what I'm wondering is more so when you were mentioning before the kind of animals, so your favorite animal comes inside, and what I find somehow strange is when you have a category that somehow animals should be before plant in that logic,
Mhm.
but then you have a parasite and you have your plant.
Mhm.
Or for example, some people get very allergic when someone treats a dog like as a pet, or
Mm.
kind of humanizes a dog. But at the same time, that is also showing some levels of humanity. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a play with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the thing that's happening. I don't know. I just see this as like the long work of like environmental humanists, right? We're just to sort of like expand these categories and, you know, question the great chain of being. And yeah, there's I think I'm going back to Neil in here. I'm trying to remember exactly what he says, where he says something about, I guess he's quoting Carrie Wolf, and he says that Carrie Wolf says, oh, well, if we decide that like plants, you know, have feelings, or I'm bastardizing this slightly, but something like, you know, what's next? Like, are we supposed to care about Ebola or something? And then Neelan says like, well, actually it doesn't matter whether you care about Ebola or not, because it's like gonna come into your body, right? And so the point is to more think about like the intermeshing of things, and how even if you wanted to keep them out, you couldn't, right? So even if you said like, I don't care about plants, or I don't think they have rights, they are still you know, exerting force upon you, right? Or even if you say like, you know, I don't care about Ebola doesn't care about you, so it doesn't matter, right? So but I guess yeah, I don't know why. I mean, yeah, it's a great question. I have to think through it. Like, what is it that people with the emotional ecologies, if it's not sexual attraction, right? So if, like, that could be one of the things that the ecosexuals are talking about, but these like millennials and plant daddies, I don't think they're buying plants because they want to have sex with them. They're buying them because they perceive plants as dependent, in which case they might be wrong, right? That plants, again, are exerting force on them. Yeah, that's a great question. What is it that people are seeing? And maybe it just depends on the person. Like, what is it they think they're getting out of it, and why do they love plants? Yeah.
So we've got a lot of questions stacking up now, and I'm going to pick Astrid because you haven't asked a question yet. So an alternative to sexual and erotic as we know it.
Yeah, hi Nicole. I found this really interesting about thinking maybe not imposing usual models of sexuality and erotic onto human-plant relationships, right? And think a little further. And I wonder if you can help us think a little bit further this way, and how would you position this further thinking in relationship on one hand to anthropomorphizing, since I see a lot of anthropomorphizing going on in human-plant relationships in ecosexualities, and on the other hand to new materialism, maybe not necessarily the other hand, but you seem to distance yourself a little bit from new materialism. Are there, yeah, maybe you can say a little bit about how you feel plant agency should or can be accounted for in alternatives to sexuality and in alternative modes of sexuality.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I guess what I like about Meeker and Spari's work, I mean, there's a lot of things, but and Joella Jacobs as well, right? That they're talking about how, for better or ill, that plants were sort of, or have been perceived as you're saying, alternatives to heteronormative models. I mean, both is happening, right? So I use the example of the thing about deflowering a virgin or whatever, right? Like, obviously that's like a way in which plants are put in the service of like normative ideas about sexuality and patriarchy. But yeah, so they have a lot of examples. Sandylands also writes about the vegetarian, the Fun Kang novel. So yeah, and I think people have been sort of putting in the chat these like examples of how plants provide these alternatives and yet get sucked back into capitalism, right? So they're providing all these alternatives, and then they just sort of get routed back into the usual. Yeah, I'm interested in thinking more about this thing I raised really briefly, which is that plants can reproduce asexually, And that is something that never gets taken up by the eco-sexuals, right? And so what does it mean to recognize that? And that doesn't get mentioned, I think, in like when Jacobs, I could be wrong, but when Jacobs has her list of like what it was that was so threatening about plants, it was like, I think, multiple pollinators and, you know, non-monogamy or whatever, but she doesn't mention, or at least people at the time didn't mention, asexuality, right? So why is that not considered like a threatening alternative? And so that's why, yeah, I just think there's too many angles to this paper, but I do feel like there's got to be some asexuality studies in my reading or in my critique. So yeah.
Wow, it's really lighting up now. Hard to keep track of, but Zia, do you want to jump in there? You haven't said anything, Jade. It seems like you're right on that point.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it actually. So I was going to raise that interesting. I was wondering if you could expand on that interesting taxonomic distinction between the asexuality as a kind of sexuality within humans and in the social sphere versus what we mean by asexuality in the rest of biology, which tends to be clonal reproduction. So reproduction without another partner of an opposite sex, or I guess in plants cases they have multiple sexes in different configurations. But yeah, you kind of just said it as I was typing, so if you wanted to expand on it, that would be great. But
yeah, I mean, you just reminded me that I did something that I like hate and critique in the rest of this talk, which is that I just like made asexuality in humans like slip into asexuality in plants, and they're very different, right? Which is like we have to acknowledge these differences, but maybe, I don't know, I guess kind of going back to Astrid's question, like maybe that can still be like inspirational somehow or something, right? You know, maybe the plant can mean something for people, even if it's not the same kind of asexuality. So, you know, not having sex versus not allosexually reproducing, those are separate things. But yeah, and I sort of doubt, again, like I said, I have no idea what people are thinking. I sort of doubt that anyone is like purchasing plants thinking like, you know, as an asexual, I would like to have this plant because it reminds me of asexuality. But I am interested in this as this idea of like the threat or the alternative, however you want to phrase it, that doesn't get recognized, right? All these other things about multiple pollinators, et cetera, gets recognized in the 1800s in Germany, but somehow people aren't picking up on this idea of like you could reproduce without anyone else, right? That's not a threat. So yeah, I think maybe there's some way to sort of, and a million theorists have done this much more elegantly, to recognize difference, but still feel some affinity, right? So saying these are not the same thing. And also obviously, extremely obvious thing to say, like sexuality as humans think of it is, it's a cultural formation, right? That carries with it all sorts of structures. And so we're, again, just the term sexuality can't be used in the same way across these different contexts, but that doesn't mean that there can't be some sort of affective connection or reverberation or whatever. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Could I just follow up quickly? Yeah, I think that's super interesting. What you were saying, I was having a conversation with a friend about cuttlefish and how cuttlefish will sometimes present in certain situations as another sex or gender, and my friend, he's a trans man, and he was really like, oh, my new kind of bio idol, in terms of this capacity to like shift physical traits. And I've got friends who do find this kind of kinship in looking at nature and recognizing that these kind of beyond the kind of male female heterosexist binary, that nature is full of possibilities, and that probably within humans as well, definitely within humans, there's a lot more than we allow for often.
Yeah, there's sorry, I know we have a lot of questions. Just real quick, I write about this a little bit. I'd be happy to send it to you. And my first book about transgender, God, I can't even remember the name of the chapter. Post-transsexual pastoral is the name of the chapter. But I write about a novel called Serious Blooms at Night, where someone is caring for a trans character and also caring for a night blooming plant. And there's not they're not collapsed into each other, right? It's not like saying like, oh, look, this plant blooms and this person's changing gender, but and it's not just justification, like, you know, treat me like, you know, this is natural, so treat me well, but it's the idea of care, right? That both things need care to do what it is they want to do. So yeah, totally with you there.
Super fascinating. And I think if you want, Nicole, you can download the chat. There's a lot of open and hanging questions, but I think, you know, it was, you know, a fascinating piece to engage with. I loved, you know, engaging with your book, and can't wait to see, you know, how this gets polished and shaped. So big round of applause. Thank you.
I didn't know you could download the chat. I was like cutting and pasting while I was talking. That's how.
Yeah, there's those little 3 dots, save chat. So we've been doing it every week, but we haven't really done anything with them. So we've got, if anyone wants access to that massive chat archive, we can probably figure out a way of making it available. But yeah, super interesting. And so next week, we're talking about bats and how bat coronaviruses can't infect humans. We've got Rodrigo Medellin, who's Mexico's foremost scholar of bat conservation, who's been doing field work throughout the pandemic and has really interesting, well-informed things to say. He's not a virologist, but he knows a lot about bat-human relations and also bat ecology. So we're reading a paper about bat caves. So you can page back to Batman if you want to get primed for that. And then I think, is Rachel, the next one is Jakob, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes.
So Jakob is a veterinary scientist in Basel, Switzerland. I recently went to his house. He's super generative and smart, and reads Whitehead of all things. And he is going to talk to us about, you know, COVID genealogies, but also human-animal interactions. He's done field work all over the place. He's doing work in the highlands of Europe, but also in Africa and other places. And yeah, among the veterinary zoologists who actually know a lot about coronavirus, I think he's one of the more interesting, you know, philosophically minded. So I'm really excited to talk with him soon. So thanks again, Nicole. It was great, and good to see some new faces and some stalwarts. So see you soon.
Thank you, guys. You helped a lot.